Okay, today Dr. Natalie Belsky will discuss the city of Riga, Latvia. She attended a conference this fall in the city and will share her reflections on this modern city with a complicated past related to World War II. I'd like to mention that this talk is co-sponsored by the Baumler-Kaplan Holocaust Commemoration Committee, and Leonore Baumler and her son Robert Baumler are here today, so thank you for joining us. And Dr. Belsky is the chair of that committee. She is an assistant professor of history in the Department of History, Political Science, and International Studies. She received her doctorate in Russian history from the University of Chicago in 2014. Her research interests include migration, minority politics in the former Soviet Union, Soviet citizenship, and East European Jewish history. She has also conducted research in Russia, Kazakhstan, Israel, and the United States. She teaches courses on modern Europe, Russian history, modern Jewish history, and world history. And just to mention, her most recent publication is from 2021, Contested Memories, Soviet and Polish Jewish Refugees and Evacuees Recount Their Experiences on the Soviet Home Front, and also Am I a Jew? Soviet Jewish Youth and Anti-Semitism on the Home Front During the Second World War. So I also want to say that Dr. Belsky has been instrumental in participating and arranging her departments and the Allworth Institute's focus on the war in Ukraine this year. So please join me in giving Dr. Belsky a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Okay, just want to make sure I'm close enough. Am I close enough to the mic? Okay, great. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Christian, for that generous introduction. It's good to see many familiar faces in the audience and some unfamiliar faces. Again, thanks for joining us, especially as we are in that point in the semester when I know most faculty and students are busy and stressed with the end of the semester looming. But I'm grateful for this opportunity to say a few words about my experience in Riga. And I'm not an expert. I'm a Russian historian. I'm not an expert in Baltic history. So a lot of what I will share is indeed things that I've learned from this most recent visit. I was a participant in a conference on Jewish refugees during and after the Holocaust. And at the University of Latvia, which is a beautiful university and a wonderful host. The conference was partly organized by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem, and we were very, very lucky to have as a participant Dr. Ilya Lensky, who is the director of the Jewish Museum in Riga. And on the last day of the conference, Dr. Lensky took us on a tour of a lot of the sites connected with the Holocaust in and around, I should say, Riga. And as I said, he's sort of been, is not only an expert on the topic, but is someone who's on the ground and has been involved and engaged in projects to commemorate these sites. And literally, I think, is one of those people who knows every single building in the former Jewish ghetto, and also happens to know all of them off the top of his head without any notes. It's kind of miraculous in that way. But it was a real privilege to have someone like him guiding us through some of the places that I will mention today. But I did want to note that where is Riga, for those who are not familiar? It's in a small European country, the capital of the small European country of Latvia, in northeast Europe, part of the Baltic states. Riga is the capital and the largest city of Latvia, with slightly over 500,000 inhabitants. It is an old and very beautiful city. So before we get into Before we get into the less fun wartime stuff, I wanted to share some images of the historic center of the city, which, as you can see there, is a really beautiful historic center. If you have a chance to go, I highly recommend it. It's a very walkable historic city with beautiful churches, museums, great food, much more affordable than places in Western Europe. So especially for students, if you're traveling around, if you have the opportunity to travel in Northern Europe, I highly recommend stopping in Riga. Language barriers are not generally a problem if you're in the historic center. And the city was actually founded in 1201. It was a member of the Hanseatic League, which was a medieval commercial and defensive confederation. Riga, in many ways, its older history connects with Germanic peoples and Germanic cultures. Baltic Germans were a major population group in the Latvian area. For a short time, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and also for about 40 years, at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, Riga was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a major early modern state that encompassed much of Eastern Europe. But during the Polish, I should show these. These are actually some pictures that I took from the observation deck of the Duomo Cathedral, the central cathedral in Riga. Again, just a really beautiful city, on a river very closely located to the Baltic Sea. But in terms of talking historically about it, Riga became part of the Russian Empire as a result of the Great Northern War, I'm sorry. Actually, I should take a step back. So it was after being part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Riga became part of the Swedish Empire at the time. This is largely the 17th century, 1621 to 1710. So that's about a little under 100 years of control by the Swedish Empire, which at that time was a very powerful empire in Europe. But the descent or the decline of the Swedish Empire took place as a result of the Great Northern War, which took place between the Swedish Empire and the Russian Empire. And in as a result of the Treaty of Nystadt, which was a treaty conducted between Sweden and Russia, and orchestrated in part by Peter the Great. Sweden accepted the defeat largely in the Great Northern War and ceded territory to Russia, to the Russian Empire. So as a result of Peter's activities and military successes, Riga and a lot of the territory of the Baltic states and specifically Latvia became part of the Russian Empire in the early 18th century. And this conquest by Russia and its part in the Russian Empire has determined Riga's history in much of the modern period. I include this in part. I wanted to include this quote in part because this history has been made even more relevant and urgent, one might say, in light of recent events. As I'm sure many of you know, Putin has been, besides waging a horrific war in Ukraine, has also been making a lot of statements about how this the invasion of Ukraine is part of a larger mission to reconquer parts of the former Russian Empire and re-annex them in some way to Russia. One hopes that a lot of these statements will purely remain parts of Putin's wild imagination, but it is some statements that he has made quite often. And just in June of this year, Putin specifically compared himself to Peter. Peter is one of his icons that I think he even has a little statue of Peter on his desk. He's one of the great, what Putin sees as kind of great, powerful Russian leaders who he likes to model himself on. And he said, Peter waged the Great Northern War for 21 years. It would seem that he was at war with Sweden. He took something from them. He did not take anything from them. He returned what was Russia's. So this is a very clear, a very clear and non-subtle statement saying that Russia has imperial ambitions in the Baltic, and has this notion that the territories that Peter conquered, which includes much of the Baltic states, should be reannexed back to Russia, because Putin argues that those were not imperial conquests, but they were in fact some kind of part of the Russian homeland as defined by Putin. So it's the war in Ukraine is a very it's a very real concern. Not just, it's a real concern around the world, I would argue, but it's a very urgent concern in the Baltic states and Latvia, in part because of their proximity and the fact that they share a border with Russia, and the fact that they're sympathetic to the cause of the Ukrainians, but also because of a real existential concern that that it's not it's possible that they may await a similar fate. And this kind of concern about Russia's and frustrations with Russia's imperial ambitions and control of that area has been a recurring theme in Riga, in Latvia, and Riga's modern history. Riga was one of the largest cities in the Russian Empire. The statistics that I have from the 1897 suggest that it was the fifth biggest city in the Russian Empire. It was a major timber export center in the Russian Empire. Historically, as I had mentioned, Riga had a large German population that ended really after the Second World War, but also had a large Russian population and a significant Jewish population, which I'll be talking about. Latvia gained its independence after World War I, and that was the first time that a state called Latvia appeared on the map of Europe. Unfortunately, that independence did not last very long. It lasted only about a little over 20 years when Latvia lost its independence in 1940 after it was annexed, essentially after a staged referendum to the Soviet Union. This was the result of for those of you who study history, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the USSR, in which they essentially decided to divide the territories in between them, largely Poland and the Baltic states, between themselves. And the Soviet Union decided that they would annex the Baltic states. And after the Second World War, the Baltic states, including Latvia, would remain under within the Soviet Union as a Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. Within the Baltic states, throughout this period, throughout the second half of the 20th century, there was a great deal of frustration and anger over Russia's control over this area, and a desire to reinstate their independence and see Russia's Soviet control come to an end. I wanted to share just one image from an event that symbolized this frustration and Latvia's return to independence in 1991. So this is actually this is actually an image of what was known as the Baltic Way or the Baltic Chain, which was a demonstration in August of 1989 in which over 1 million protesters were lined up to form a continuous human chain stretching 675 kilometers through the 3 Baltic states, from the capital cities of Vilnius in Lithuania to Riga to Tallinn in Estonia. And I was very much reminded of this history as I was walking through. That's picture that I took as I was walking through one of the central squares in Riga, and I saw this plaque with, you see the two foot marks, and it says Baltic Chain, Vilnius, Riga, Tallinn. And this is an image from the time of that demonstration. That demonstration actually took place on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as a sign of frustration or denunciation of the pact and its consequences for the Baltic states. So, as I mentioned, Riga has this fraught history with its powerful neighbor to the east, Russia. There's I was in Riga in September, and you could see kind of quite a few signs of solidarity with the Ukrainian cause, and frustration with, anger with what Putin and the Russian military was doing in Ukraine. So this building right here is the Russian embassy, which, as far as I know, is still open in Riga. And but what they've done is essentially put up kind of a makeshift exhibit of about the war across the street from the embassy. So you have this kind of "Stop Putin, Stop War" signs with a lot of really kind of handmade sort of posters tacked onto them. And there's also some photographs of cities in Ukraine and the results of the war there that are also on display there. And then on the other side, so this is the embassy, this is the exhibit, and then on the other side of the street, on the other corner, I guess, is this huge poster of Putin, very flattering, as you can see. That is literally faces the windows of the embassy. Right, it's not accidental that they put it there. And as you can see in that photograph, the poster is, it's like a 4-story building, and that poster is about 2 or 3 stories high, so you can't miss it. Our first day in Riga, a friend was driving us around, and we were in that neighborhood, and I saw it kind of out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, what is that? And then I ended up coming back to take a picture. But that is, that is there. So again, there is this very real sentiment. Obviously I can't speak for all Latvians, and there's also division within Latvia between Latvian and Russian, between Latvians of Latvian background and Latvians of Russian background. So that's a whole other complicated story. But there's certainly again, just clear demonstration on the street of what people think about what's going on in Ukraine. And in fact, I brought a booklet from the Latvian Occupation Museum, which is a relatively new museum in Riga, which talks about the title of this pamphlet is The Three Occupations of Latvia. And the three occupations of Latvia are the Soviet occupation of 40 to 41, then the Nazi occupation of 41 to 44, and then the second Soviet occupation of 44 to 91. And if you visit this museum, there's actually museums like this in Vilnius and in Tallinn, kind of almost similar titles, though the one in Vilnius was initially called the Genocide Museum. The narrative is clearly oriented towards Soviet aggression and Soviet occupation, and they will even, in some cases, I don't know about Latvia, but in Tallinn we were kind of told straight out that the Nazi occupation was not the worst occupation; it was the Soviets that were the worst, which is understandable if you look from a Latvian perspective or a Baltic perspective. It's a different story if you look at the Baltic Jewish perspective, in which case the Nazi occupation was, of course, horrific. So again, kind of an interesting history there. You don't get to go to a lot of places where they tell you the Nazis weren't that bad. So this is one of those. Again, this is not to say that the Latvians are pro-Nazi or anything like that, but they have felt that they have been, they have felt they've been victimized mostly in the 20th century, primarily by the Soviets, and they have very good reason to say that. The Gulag, the occupation, stealing their independence, all of that it's not anything it's totally understandable. But there is this kind of wartime history there, which is the country still grappling with, and that wartime history has to do with the history of the Holocaust. Jews were not a huge presence in Latvia, but in 1935, approximately 94,000 Jews lived in Latvia, which made up about 5% of the population. Half of those lived in Riga, the capital. There was a network of Jewish schools with over 100 institutions. So Jews were certainly not as prominent in Latvia as they were in a place like Poland, but they were also in a place like Riga, they were also a very visible group. There was a Jewish neighborhood. As I said, they were there. In July of 1941, the Nazis occupied Latvia, and very quickly, established their control over Riga. Very shortly thereafter, a ghetto was created in Riga, where Jews were initially confined. Very shortly after the occupation, in fact, on July 4th of 1941, the Great Choral Synagogue in Riga was burned down by the Nazis with people inside. From what I've seen, there's some different numbers floating around. Some say there were only about 20 people inside, many of them who were refugees. But other statistics say that it was actually close to 400 people who were in that synagogue and were killed as a result. After the war, the remains of the burnt-out synagogue were demolished by the Soviets. The Soviets were not particularly respectful of a lot of these sites, and the area was turned into a public square. A commemorative stone marking the location was placed there only in 1988. And after the restoration of Latvia's independence, a memorial designed by a Latvian architect in the shape of the synagogue walls with built-in archaeological remains in the original building found at the site was erected in the 1990s. So that's a photograph from the 1930s of the synagogue. It was actually a pretty large synagogue. These are the remains. This is what I saw when I was there in September. Those are partly the archaeological remains, partly built up walls that were built on top of them. As I said, that memorial is recent. And we have some plaques here, which I realize would be hard to see for you, but they talk about Jews who were, their murder by they're being forced out of their homes and imprisoned in the ghettos. And the fact that the synagogue was put on fire, was burned down 3 days after the Nazi invasion, while the Jews inside were prevented from escaping. This suggests that the death toll surpassed 400 people. Thanks to the fact that we had this wonderful tour guide, he shared with us that the placing of this plaque was quite fraught, or the discussion surrounding the wording on the plaque was quite fraught. What is the reason for that? Well, one of the reasons for that is that one of the main participants in the burning of the synagogue and the murder of Jews in Riga and its environs more generally was the Arise Commando, which was a local Latvian auxiliary unit that collaborated with the Nazis, and as I said, participated in the persecution of Jews. The number of people in the Arise Commando range. I've seen that the unit numbered about 300 to 500 men during the period when it was participating in these killings, though at its peak, it was about 1,500 members. And there has been a lot of understandable controversy or sensitivity around the discussion of this unit because it was made up of Latvians and the admission of their participation in these killings. So on this plaque here, the wording reads, the local auxiliary police unit under the command of Victor's Arise, subjected to the German security police and security service, burnt the synagogue on the order of the Nazis.
In what language?
This is it's English and Latvian, that's what the two languages of the plaque. So, but as I said, Dr. Lensky shared with us that they went back and forth on, do we mention Arise? As you note there, it says local auxiliary unit. It does not say local Latvian auxiliary unit. And it obviously says that the unit was under the authority of the Nazis, which is true, but many of these people were volunteers, so they didn't necessarily have to be part of this unit. So that, as I said, as he shared, there was a lot of back and forth about what could be said. They clearly didn't want to say that it was a Latvian unit, but Arise was arrested and died in prison many years later, but after the war. So, his guilt is not really questioned. But again, the history of this event and of this unit is a really difficult one. So as I mentioned, a ghetto was created in Latvia, sealing off about 30,000 Jews. Later on, the Nazis actually, as they exterminated many of the Jews in the Riga ghetto at the end of 1941, they brought in Jews from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia to the ghetto in Riga, and those Jews were also later exterminated in the site in the Rumbula forest, which I will discuss in just a few minutes. We also visited the site of the old Jewish cemetery, which was included in the site of the Riga ghetto that would have been set up. When the ghetto existed, Jews who had been executed, committed suicide, or had been murdered were buried here, the total number reaching about 2,000. After World War II, the remaining tombstones were stolen. The brick walls were demolished, and the local government transformed the old Jewish cemetery into the Park of Communist Brigades in 1960. Only in 1994 did a memorial stone with the Star of David was a memorial stone with the Star of David erected on the side of the street, and in 2007 a memorial stone was unveiled, also bearing an inscription in English and Hebrew. Here was situated the old Jewish cemetery, wandering through this, you can kind of tell in this picture, wandering through the site, you wouldn't know you were in a former cemetery unless someone told you, because it looks like a park, with these two memorial plaques. Dr. Lensky shared with us that I believe it's the Star of David plaque has been desecrated, has been vandalized several times, and they've had to, put it back up. So the plaque here notes that the first Jewish cemetery, which was opened in the 18th century, the mortuary was burned down in 1941, and as I mentioned, after the war, the tombstones were removed and used as building materials. But only in 1992 was the park renamed the Old Jewish Cemetery. So again, quite difficult. And in part, a lot of this erasing of historical sites and massacre sites was orchestrated by the Soviets, largely because they did not. The Soviet regime did not really want to talk about the particularity of suffering during the war. They wanted to subsume it all under a narrative of Soviet civilians perished during the Second World War. Many millions of Soviet civilians perished during the Second World War. But these particular sites that you couldn't get away from the fact that they were Jewish sites. It was the Jewish cemetery. It was the Jewish synagogue. If you put up a memorial there, you had to talk about the fact that these sites were targeted because they were Jewish sites. So rather than talk about that, they just tended to raise the site and just kind of not talk about it. Which was also what happened at the Rumbula Forest, which was the site of execution of most of Riga's Jews. And not just Riga's Jews, also Jews from other parts of Europe. In the former Soviet territories, as those of you who've been in my classes probably know, Jews were generally not shipped to concentration camps or extermination camps like Auschwitz or Treblinka, but rather they were often taken to a site not far from their community, a forest, a remote site, a ravine, where they were shot and placed in mass graves. And that is exactly what happened outside of Riga. The two major actions, as they were referred to, the first two actions, as they were referred to, took place on November 30th, 1941, and December 8th to 9th, 1941. So I think it's quite symbolic that we are gathering here on the 81st anniversary of the first major shooting of Jews in Riga. So the vast majority of those who had been placed in the ghetto, with the exception of some who were singled out as particularly useful laborers, were taken to the Rumbula Forest, as I mentioned, and shot. They were taken there they were moved there with the assistance of the units like the Arise Commando. The most of the shooting that took place there were done by the SS and the German Order Police. 20,000 Jews deported from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia who were sent to Riga were also in later years taken during the war, killed, murdered in Rumbula. In 1944, the Germans forced as the war was ending and things were not looking great for the Nazis, the Germans forced the prisoners to reopen the mass graves in Rumbula and burn the bodies. The memorialization of the Rumbula Forest massacres also took some time. So in 1963, thanks to the initiative of the local Jewish community, a memorial plaque with an inscription in Yiddish was placed on a pine in the Rumbula Forest, with a poster that was also placed on the site of the Rumbula Railway depicting a figure of a man who's seemingly rising from the grave with his fist clenched, symbolizing a protest against these crimes. Both the memorial plaque and the poster were removed the following year by 1964. However, they succeeded in getting this plaque put up, which was, they had official permission to put the plaque up with an inscription to the victims of fascism, and you see those words written in Latvian, Russian, and Yiddish. But noting that to the victims of so it's written in Yiddish, which suggests that there's a kind of a Jewish connection there, but it just says victims of fascism. It doesn't say Jewish victims of fascism or anything to that effect. And the plaque, actually, the kind of the metal plaque here notes that that the monument, this was put up after 91, that the monument was erected under the Soviets by the Riga Jewish community, and it was the only Jewish memorial to victims of Nazi terror in the territory of the USSR, which Dr. Lensky told us was contested. But Rumbula, it is important to mention, is one of the largest massacre sites in the former Soviet territory. After Babi Yar, which was the largest site, which is right outside of Kiev, this was one of the biggest massacre sites. In recent years, in the 2000s, there's been a lot more activity to put up memorial sites that and memorial plaques that specifically mention Jewish victims. A memorial ensemble that was unveiled in Rumbula in 2002, created with the financial support granted by institutions of Latvia, Israel, the US, and Germany, as well as by private persons. So this is the plaque that was put up in 2002. The language here is in Latvian English, which basically reads to the memory of the Jewish victims who were remembered in the Rumbula forest. Testified to by the President of the State of Israel, the President of the Republic of Latvia, during the first state visit of the President of Israel in Latvia in 2000. Is this 2000? No, it's 2015, but this part was put up in 2002. And this one actually says victims of Nazi terror. And there's a really, so this is entering the memorial ensemble, or a memorial park, I guess. I mean, it's interesting because when you're there, other than these plaques, it's a forest, right? It's not really a park. It's just, what you see there behind the stones, right? That's what it looks like. But there are these paths that lead you to these particular sites. And this is another one of the memorial plaques. This one reads, here in the forest of Rumbula on November 30th and December 8th of 1941, the Nazis and their local collaborators, shot dead more than 25,000 Jews, the prisoners of the Riga ghetto, children, women, elderly people, as well as around 1,000 Jews deported from Germany. In the summer of 1944, hundreds of Jewish men from the concentration camp Riga Kaiserwald were killed here. So that is the more recent plaque, and this is the memorial there. It's a little bit hard to take a picture of it, but it is quite a beautiful memorial. As you see there, this is a menorah that is made out of steel, but it looks like roots, so it's kind of fits into the forest background. And you see these little, the stones there, made to look like tombstones in part, very much similar to memorial in the Treblinka Memorial. They're laid out in the shape of a Star of David. You can't really see it from probably where you are at, but a lot of the stones have names of streets in the Riga ghetto with family names of people who lived there. So again, to pay respect to those who perished there. So that at the same time as you walk through, as you said, we were kind of walking through this forest park, memorial park, I don't know what you want to call it. And you sometimes see these sort of raised concrete beds with these rectangular poles, and a lot of those are marking mass graves, or where we know that they're mass graves. A lot of the difficulty of creating these kinds of memorial sites in the former Soviet Union is that the Nazis often burn the bodies and just kind of covered up the ground, so we don't know exactly where some of these sites were. Locals will often tell you, like locals who were around at the time, of which now there's not that many, will be able to tell you sometimes where the massacre sites took place, where the massacres took place specifically, like where the ground is. But in a lot of cases, okay, it's in the Rumbula Forest, but the Rumbula Forest is a big place. It's not like, and you, it does, massacre sites don't look any different than the rest of the forest. So this is, I should have probably included an image of the Salaspils concentration camp, which is, so this memorial complex at Rumbula, as we see, has been worked upon and has been built up in the last few years, which is great. It's still kind of, you have to, you don't stumble upon it, right? In order to get there, you have to take a bus. You can't, it's not an obvious choice of place to visit unless you know that that's what you're looking for. Much more frequently, people visit the Salaspils concentration camp, which is a much more dramatic and bigger complex. It was a memorial, and a memorial to the camp was built in during the Soviet era, and it's a much more common sort of, I don't know if tourist site is the right term, but certainly that would be before anyone would recommend that you go to Rumbula, they would tell you to go to Salaspils. Salaspils was a Nazi concentration camp, largely a work camp, and there were some Jewish victims who were there. There were not that many Jewish victims there, so it wasn't really a quote-unquote Jewish site, though it was certainly a site of German oppression. But it was interesting when we went there. I went there with my mother, who was born and raised in the Soviet Union, and she visited the Salaspils campsite in the 1960s, 1970s, and late 60s and beginning of 70s, when the site was just opened by the Soviets. And when we got there, she said, oh yes, this is the Salaspils extermination camp, because that's what they were told it was. The Soviets called it an extermination camp. Lager Smrti. Our guide said, well, no, it wasn't. It was a concentration camp. It wasn't really an extermination camp. Not to say that people didn't die there. They did, but that was not the prime purpose of it. It was a concentration site. It was labor site, concentration camp site. So, and she said, and my mother has an amazing memory. She's like, no, I know they told us it was an extermination camp. And our guide said, yeah, I know they told you that. But what it really was this. So it may seem like a little of sort of getting into the weeds. But these distinctions are important because it is important to think about which sites are emphasized and which sites get a lot of attention and which sites don't, and why. And that's kind of a clear element. That's a kind of a clear part of the story. The story that the Soviet regime wanted to tell was one about civilians and of all nations and races being victimized by the Germans, as they were, by the Nazi regime. I should say by the Nazi authorities, occupation authorities. But one that didn't talk specifically about Jewish victimization and the Holocaust. I did want to end on a high note, which is, part of this new sites that have been constructed in Latvia, in Riga, is a beautiful memorial and museum dedicated to Janis Lipke and his wife. Lipke was an incredible man who decided to help, who was a rescuer, had decided to help the Jews of Riga. Lipke was a port worker who became a contractor for the German Air Force and used this position to smuggle Jewish workers out of Riga area camps. He was very clever he wasn't a well-off person by any stretch of the imagination, but he was clearly very good at figuring out how to work around the rules, how to manipulate people, how to use people to his advantage, and how to work the system, essentially. He was clearly very good at this. He was able to smuggle approximately 40 people and hide them in various places until the arrival of the Red Army in October of 1944. And in fact, according to Yad Vashem, which awarded him the Righteous Among the Nations prize, which is given to Gentiles who helped rescue Jews, he was awarded that prize in 1966. And in fact, the Soviets didn't want him to go to Israel to get the prize, but he was somehow able to travel to Australia under the pretext that he was visiting someone, and then they smuggled him into Israel and then back into the Soviet Union. Again, like how this guy did all this, and somehow he also did this while bringing back like 2 car motors that he had acquired in Australia. So how you like smuggle yourself across borders with like car motors is beyond me, but this is clearly why I would not be able to do what he and his family did. He was given the opportunity to, the Israeli government offered him to give him a house, to set him up in Israel and set him up for life. He said no, that he basically his entire life stayed in the home where he had lived with his wife, from before the war. He was actually questioned by the Soviet authorities after the war because they thought that he was that he had done something shady. That they thought that he was. They accused him of. They didn't believe that he did all of this out of the goodness of his heart. And they even kind of thought that he was some kind of collaborator. So he did not, that was kind of the payment he received for what he had done. But as I said, despite that, he did not want to leave Latvia. But the 40 people that he and his wife rescued constitutes, according to Yad Vashem, and I did not independently verify this, but I do trust Yad Vashem, constitutes 1/5 of an estimated total of 200 Jews that survived on Latvian soil. So pretty impressive. He passed away in 1987, and they held an impressive funeral for him. And the museum that has now been built, I believe it was built on the site of his house. He did hide people in his house in part, but he also hid them in other places because you couldn't hide 40 people in, the house of someone who wasn't particularly wealthy. It's just a beautiful museum with documents with footage of his wife who outlived him talking about what he had done and why he had done it and how they had done it, and how she participated actively in helping him and smuggling these people, and agreed with him that they had to do this no matter what the consequences were. Had they been caught, the consequences were that they would be shot, they and their children, like no question about that. But she basically says that they just thought that this was what what they had to do, and that's what they did miraculously successfully. And as I said, the museum, it's a modern, beautiful museum. We visited there at the end of our day, and we had been on this excursion. Imagine being on an excursion from 9 to like 5:30 p.m. with someone who has like an encyclopedic memory and is giving you a lot of really interesting information. But even for me as a professional historian, I was like, I cannot anymore listen to anything. So we came to this museum past closing. They kept it open for us. And all of us were just kind of exhausted just from information exhaustion. But just how moving and how beautiful this museum was really revived us. So I think it's a good point to end that despite the horrific history of this World War II history, and the problematic commemoration of that history, there is some real amazing stories that come out of that time. Thank you very much.
We have some questions, and maybe I'll try to remind you to repeat that to Natalie.
Sure.
In case. Any questions? Erin?
Would you be able to go into a little bit more detail on what tactics the Soviet Union used to stop memorial buildings?
What, sorry?
What tactics the Soviet Union used to stop these memorials from being built?
Yeah, so there's actually a recent book that talks about kind of this like community. Sorry, Erin asked about what tactics the Soviet regime used to stop specific memorials from being built, which is a great question. So there were quite a few efforts, not just in Riga, but across the Soviet Union by Jewish communities to commemorate these sites, just kind of ad hoc efforts. But the way the Soviet Union was structured is you couldn't just raise money and say, oh, I'm going to put this memorial up in this park, right? You had to get permission from the state authorities. And the state authorities, if they didn't like what you were proposing, said no. So it was all like, there was no such thing as like a private memorial. Everything was public and everything had to be vetted. So, but that's a great question. Which is not to say, as I said, there was memory and there were Jewish organizations or local Jews who tried to commemorate a lot of these sites. Of course, in many places, the Jewish community no longer existed, right? So that was another challenge. But if the efforts weren't condoned by the state and approved by a state body, like the local municipal authorities, it wasn't going to happen, or they would tear it down. So, great question.
Other questions? Natalie, is there much of a level of anti-Semitism in Latvia today? I mean, we know it's on the rise here, but...
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't, the Latvia, I don't have the numbers in front of me. The Latvian Jewish community is pretty small. There has been a trend of sort of memory laws that have been passed in Poland. I know that there was one passed in Lithuania, and I forgot to look it up. I think there might have been one passed in Latvia. There's also been some in Ukraine that basically officially say what one can and can't talk about, and generally it's about talking about collaboration. I'd have to look up and see. I'm not sure what if there's current legislation in Latvia about that, but I believe there is, but don't quote me on that. But that has to do, it's a form of anti-Semitism because it's a form of saying what you can and can't say about what happened to the Jewish population. But it has more to do with kind of pushing that the official narrative would be, Nazis killed Jews, not Latvians. Despite the fact that the Rice Commando auxiliary units in Lithuania in particular, and auxiliary units in Ukraine were definitely complicit in murder of Jews. And we have plenty of evidence for that.
And go ahead.
Well, I wonder about how anti-Semitism as such is addressed in the Baltic states.
Yeah, I think that, as I said, I think the major issue is about discussing the anti-Semitic past, which is discussing, not so much targeting, I haven't come across, and again, it's not that I have looked extensively for that, but specific examples of Jews being targeted today, though what Dr. Lensky shared with us was, as I said, that the memorial at the cemetery had been vandalized, and that their efforts to get memorials put up in other sites of the Jewish ghetto have been, like there's a former hospital that they've been trying to get to use for the Jewish community and to create like a memorial site there, I believe, and they have gotten rebuffed by the local authorities. So there's sort of there's sort of a pushback against putting up a lot of these sites, and there's pushback. There's certainly pushback against giving some of these buildings or some of these sites to the giving them to ownership or whatever control to specific organizations like the Museum of Jews in Latvia, and letting them put up memorials there or something like that. So that's been an issue, it seems. I don't know. I have not heard, which does not mean that it doesn't happen, of specific instances of Jews being targeted. But there's complication about talking specifically about the Holocaust, because as I said, like if you visit a lot of these museums, the occupation museums, which are official museums, big structures, you can't miss them kind of thing. They don't really, they talk very little about the Holocaust. It's sort of not denied, but certainly not the focus. So, Lisa, did you?
Yeah, I was just gonna comment that I was in Kiev twice, once in 1984, and no one brought us at all to Baba Yar, nothing.
Mhm.
Then I was again in 1990, and at that point, I was working as a tour guide, and our Soviet tour guide was with, and we went to Baba Yar, but it was really kind of confusing. They didn't seem to know what to say exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm offering that as an example. Like they were, yes, this happened here, but it was really confusing.
Yeah.
Here and there.
Summarize that a little bit.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I should have. Well, what Lisa mentioned was that when she went to Kiev in the 80s, the tour guide didn't take them to Babi Yar, which is the main massacre site of Jews in Kiev, and that more recently was that 2000s or no 90s?
1990s. Still under Soviet regime.
That they were taken to the place, but it wasn't quite clear what the narrative that they were trying to present was. And Babi Yar is one of these places, where the Soviets, the Soviets kind of got rid of a lot of they put up a park or an apartment building, not an apartment building, but they put up some kind of random structure there. And then only later did they begin to put up memorials there. The initial memorial was to all victims of fascism. We don't talk about Jews. Then more recently, we have a number of memorials that have gone up since the 90s and the 2000s, memorials that talk specifically about Jewish victims. But there's also, at Babi Yar, there's a memorial to Orthodox priests who were killed there. And then there's a separate memorial to children. And then it's just kind of, I think, and there's a Gypsy Roma, a Roma Sinti memorial, a Roma Sinti memorial that has been put up. So it's kind of, it's I can see why it would be disjointed even then, because you're not really sure what you're supposed to be looking at. And in part it has to do with an acknowledgement that many groups were killed at Babi Yar. But that there's this also confusion in different eras of commemoration at work there. My dad's about 12 or 13 members of my grandmother, my paternal grandmother's family perished at Babi Yar, my dad didn't go to Babi Yar until he was in his 20s. Actually, my mom was very frustrated because she said she was the one that took him to Babi Yar, not his mother. She took him there in the 80s. And he knew that his family had perished there, but like my grandmother said, she didn't want to traumatize him or something to that effect. But she was kind of one of those people who didn't really talk about it until later in life, which was for a lot of people the case, because it wasn't really acceptable to talk about it publicly, and just a lot of people just didn't talk about it privately either. So.
Any final questions at all? Well, thank you again, Natalie, very much.
Thank you
for ending on this heroic story.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story.
It's a bit depressing.
If you ever go to Riga, I definitely, it's not off the beaten track, but it's certainly not it's in the city of Riga. But if you ever go to Riga, I would definitely recommend going to this museum. It's really wonderful.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you all.